to your patients.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think we're ready.
Okay, everyone hear me? Yes, good. Hi, everyone. Diana Sokolov with the San Francisco Planning Department. Happy to be here today. I wanted to talk about resiliency and kind of the other half, not necessarily about shocks, but about stresses to the system. And as David mentioned, we have earthquakes in our midst, and I'm actually really jealous of the people who work on earthquakes because it's like there are no earthquake deniers, right? So no one is going to tell you that you're smoking whatever and that we can't listen to you, and it's not going to happen because it has happened and we've seen the damage, and it's quite obvious that there's a huge problem that we're facing. But with sea level rise, it's kind of one of those slow-moving threats that kind of creeps up on you, and we see it little by little, and there's a lot more ponding and flooding in San Francisco, and the bay has risen about a foot already over the past 100 years. And so it's obviously it's happening. I don't think there are any deniers in this audience. Well, maybe there are, but I don't want to know. And but it's a lot more difficult to talk about, and so that's really why the mayor convened this coordinating committee, so that there could be some attention that's paid to this issue, and that we start really rounding out the concepts of resilience to include not just earthquakes and other kinds of shocks, but also the stresses that happen to a system over time. And
just click back and I'll try that.
Oh, there we go. It's about a button. Okay, so these are the folks that make up the Mayor's Sea Level Rise Coordinating Committee. I'm co-chairing the committee with the Port of San Francisco, which is a great marriage because what's happening with the seawall, which I know you'll hear about during the tour and later this afternoon, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of attention being paid to the seawall for good reason, and so getting those folks together to work with each other is incredibly important. And coordinating at this scale, high-level city employees working together to come up with a plan to solve this problem is incredibly important. The coordination effort is really huge. So going back to what I said earlier about getting people to really think about this issue, one of the tools that I have at my disposal is to show people, well, what if you did nothing? So if you did nothing and the sea rose per the National Research Council's 2012 projections, which are probably going to tick up in their next round, of 108 inches. And so that is 66 inches of sea level rise at 2100, end of century, plus about 40 inches of storm surge or king tides. So it's 66 inches of inundation by 2100, and then temporary flooding, adding another 40 inches. And so then we got to about $75 billion. And that number is significant. It's actually not even as high as it probably could be or should be. It's a very, very rough estimate. It's just looking at replacement value. So if something happened to a building, it got inundated, it had to be replaced, or some infrastructure. For instance, our Muni system right here at the foot of the ferry building, if that got flooded and the equipment needed to be replaced, that's the kind of calculation that this was. It's not looking at loss of productivity, business closure, general community values, the inequities that would occur with an event like this happening, and how it would be borne on folks who are already stressed or in disadvantaged areas. So it doesn't look at loss of ecosystem value. So it's really kind of a low number, actually. Oh, and a large part of it is the airport. Just FYI on that. And so, well, here we are. Here is our famous Embarcadero and some of the problems that we're seeing. One of the things that definitely rings true for me is when I hear the port operators talking about how they have less time now to do the repairs and maintenance that they need to do on the seawall and on the wharfs and the bulkheads. And it's just the window is shrinking with their ability to actually do those repairs. And this is just a photo of some of the disrepair that we need to be paying attention to. Our airport, the airport is very, very vulnerable. They're developing a perimeter defense system, and they're going to really need to work on not just defending the runways, but also what happens if you defend the runways and you build a perimeter defense system. What happens to San Mateo County, like the rest of the county? And I that photo that David had in his slideshow in the beginning, where you've got that one house standing, and the airport's really super important. I mean, it's a regional economic engine for internationally. So it's really important that the airport is functioning properly. But if you can't get to other places, if the airport's doing well, then that's a problem too. And if people can't get to work, that's a problem too. And so we think about this problem really around, well, we should just focus on the folks who are in that vulnerability zone, that 108 inches. And here's a photo. So the blue line is that 108 inches. And that's end of century. And so, well, we should just talk to those people. But it really is, for San Francisco, in my own personal focus, it's a citywide issue. It's people who may not be able to get to work. It's people who may not be able to flush their toilets. So everybody has a stake in this problem. And we have an opportunity now to actually do something about it before incurring all the costs and the damage over time. And possibly creating, what folks, a term of art that I hear a lot is these islands of resilience. That house sitting in the, from Hurricane Ike, that photo, that shot, that's what that means. It's like, well, you've got this structure and it's totally protected, but nothing around it is protected. And that's a problem. So we can't have that happen. So we put out this action plan, and it's really a call to action. And as John King at the Chronicle loves to rib me about, well, you're planning to plan. So you just gave me such a hard time about that. But I mean, okay, fine. Yes, well, at least we're planning. Okay, well, at least we're doing something, right? We're not ignoring it. We are moving forward. And so this is our plan. And so I'm in the process of now developing a work program to implement this plan. And it's really about embedding resiliency into all levels of government. We all need to think about this on our daily basis when we're building a project, any project, whether it's in the vulnerability zone or not. This needs to be considered, whether you're a private sector or public sector. And so this is just it's our kind of our resiliency wheel, so to speak, or adaptation wheel. And we are, let's see, we've done a lot of science review. We could always have more science, and we can study this forever, and the numbers will change, guaranteed. That's really the only thing we know, is that it'll change. And so we have to kind of plan for the numbers to tick up and plan for kind of worst case scenarios in a lot of ways. But we have to balance that out with cost. And so budgets and resources, it's all a big trade-off. And that's, as a planner, that's what I do on a daily basis, is I think about all the trade-offs. And I think about that in the context of who is in my audience today, when we're talking about preservation of historic resources and how important they are, and how you are able to preserve those resources against the cost of preserving possibly something else or working on something else. And how do you manage that? How do you figure that out? What's most important? And what's most important is what is important to you and to all of the people in the city, and to people who come here to the city for their jobs and rely on the city for their economy and for their fun and their tourism and their vitality. And so our process is to look at assessing vulnerability. So that's about where we are right now. We've done a bit of that already. So we have a pretty decent sense. We've done a lot of exposure mapping. So we know, when we look at that blue line, we know exactly what's at risk. And so we can see it. We can see it on a map. But what we don't know entirely is, okay, well, we have this pump station, and when was it built, and what's its capacity to actually adapt over time, and how is it a resilient piece of infrastructure? We don't know that about everything that's in our vulnerability zone, and so that's really what we're doing, is a detailed assessment of all of that information, private sector and public sector. And then we'll be assessing the risk. And really, this piece is really critically important because it's about your values. It's more about what you care about and what level of risk you're willing to take for the assets in the city. And what do you care about? Do you want to save the beach? Do you want to save the historic piers? What do we want to save? We don't have unlimited resources. So we have to really think about it and kind of reach down deep and say, okay, well, I get it. I have a finite set of resources and money, and I can do these things. And so we're going to enable folks like yourselves to come in and help and tell us what you care about and what you want. And we'll be providing lots of tools to enable you to participate in that discussion. And ultimately, it's your decision. They're not my decisions. I'm just the sort of the vessel to get that information from you. And so, So we'll be developing an adaptation plan based on the information we get out of the risk assessment and the vulnerability assessment, and implementing monitoring, and then probably going back and doing some of it again as the numbers tick up, as I mentioned. So one of the things that's going to help us figure out exactly how we want to adapt our city is by bringing all the best minds all around the world to help us conceptualize what a resilient city could look like. And so this is an idea that came out of post-Hurricane Sandy, rebuild by design. And I'll talk about it more this afternoon if you're coming to the afternoon panel. But it's a design challenge to help people really visualize what their city could look like. If you think about this with a resilience lens, multidisciplinary, delivering multiple benefits.
I know you have an opinion on this first one, so I get your say on this. But maybe Diana, I'll direct this with you since you're within the city. And one of my main questions was, how do we generate political will for these, what are long-term programs and policies in an environment, that's sort of a short-term focus in terms of the political election cycle? How do we overcome that challenge and make sure that these programs continue over that time frame?
Well, I do think it's a two-pronged approach, and I think that at the mayoral level, in City Hall, directors of departments, it's really important that folks understand what they're going to have to pay for if they don't do anything. And so I think that's why we really got cracking on looking at what is the cost of doing nothing. And that actually speaks volumes to people. And so for Mayor Lee, he really cares about, when he leaves office eventually, he wants to set the city up for success. And he wants his predecessor to also have a successful opportunity to look at how we've made a real effort to uncomplicate these problems and actually explain them to people, get people engaged and involved, and that's kind of how that system works. And also when people really understand that the citizens and the businesses in the city care about it as well, that's really important. So it comes from the top down and then the bottom up. And I definitely think, Dana, you touched on this also. I mean, I think that people who live here need to understand and care about this issue. And so it's a matter of communicating it to voters and people who actually vote for politicians, and getting them to start calling their supervisors and saying, hey, I really care about this. I think this is important, and this is how it's going to affect my community. This is how it's going to affect my children, children's children, and this is what I think we should do about it. And so doing a lot of outreach and making sure that people are engaged and involved in the conversation is really critically important to getting politicians to care.
Well, this is going to sound like disagreement, but it's not really. But one of the things I try.
You don't have to say it.
So my lesson 5 kind of addressed Eric's question. This has to be somebody's job. You have to have somebody assigned to do this, and our fire marshal is already busy. Our city's risk manager is already busy. Our building official already busy. So this was the great insight of the Rockefeller Foundation, was to make it somebody's job, give it its own title. And that's necessary, but it's a short-term solution. So here's where I agree with Diane. Ultimately, for government to be good, these ideas have to be mainstreamed into the culture. You don't have to now convince the fire marshal to be thinking about safety as opposed to thinking about putting out fires. They think about that. Same with the building division. But if we want to get into new ideas about resilience and recovery and make those be kind of mainstream within the culture of the building department, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen because you tell them, work on this now and put this on your plate, which is already full. So you have the chief resilience officer who can reach out to the different departments, do the coordination between them, but ultimately that position wants to transition into something that is long-term and it's not associated with an election cycle, and it is mainstreamed into the culture of the various agencies and departments that have to work with it. And ideally into the private sector as well.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the city. I think the biggest thing is you have to find the group that is loudest and has the most political sway, and that the mayor or administrator or whoever is most scared of, and figure out what they care about, and then give them what they need in order to make a decision. Or there has to be one person at the city who really cares about this quite a bit and has the political know-how and the authority to push something through. I've seen this happen at multiple cities. So for example, in Palo Alto right now, they've just finished an extensive analysis of all of their earthquake vulnerable buildings. And the vast majority of the people that were on the advisory committee were wealthy, well-educated building owners. And those are the ones needed to be convinced. So they did a lot of financial analysis on it. And there are like pages and pages of why it's a good business case for the building owners, because those are the people who have a lot of sway in the city. Whereas in Hayward, the city just said, we're going to do this, they're doing it. They didn't, they've consulted people, but they didn't do the same level of analysis because in their city, they say, people are used to doing what we tell them to do. So we're just going to do it. Those are the two extremes, but usually there's something in the middle that allows people to become educated and convinced.
Resilience requires mandates. Mandates only come through legislation. Legislation has a particular pattern that it has to follow, as Dana described. The leadership is important, but the other model we saw also in Los Angeles, where one charismatic scientist who'd been working on this for 30 years was able to get the ear of the mayor and have some things passed. Now, I think they probably should have and could have done things differently, but the main point is that Lucy Jones is fantastic, but she cannot be replicated elsewhere. So there's a bad model to try to follow.
So you just said that it was actually a perfect segue into my second question, and then we'll take some from the audience as well. But you said that resiliency requires mandates, and I want to maybe have a healthy discussion here about that here within this panel about clearly you believe that the stick is more effective than the carrot, but I want to talk about the role of both mandatory and voluntary programs at the state, city, and regional level, and where are they effective? Where can they be effective in both mandatory and voluntary programs? So, would you like to expand on that? Maybe we can get into some of the other panel members.
Sure. Well, the case example I gave was the Bell Pizza in Napa. You can be recovered by doing the work out of your own enlightened self-interest, but it doesn't make a difference because your neighbors didn't do it. This is not just a concept of engineering. It's not just an observation we made from 1 or 2 earthquakes. We see it all over the place because we're thinking beyond safety. Resilience is a collective action problem. Economists have studied this for years. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And you can look that up later, but the point is that in this situation, where your success depends on the performance of others similarly situated, just doing the right thing yourself because you've been properly incentivized is not going to help achieve the solution. So it's not just an opinion. This is actually something I think we, as engineers and as public safety advocates and as resilience advocates, we need to be learning from other disciplines as well. We need to be learning from epidemiologists and from economists and from game theorists. Those tools are out there, and the only reason we haven't used them so far is because we have 100 years of thinking about one building at a time.
So, and I don't disagree that these requires a mandate, but what role can voluntary programs play to supplement those mandates, or is there one?
Well, okay, my most cynical answer to that is do it, and the reason you do it is to prove that they don't work. We did this in San Francisco with the soft storage program. We had a voluntary program. We passed bond money. If you voted in San Francisco, you're going to see that we set aside a lot of bond money years ago. It was never used. Never used. So now we're trying to repurpose it, and that's on the ballot tomorrow. Vote for it. But we had a voluntary retro program for the soft storage buildings. Nobody complied, and that allowed us to make the argument that we needed a mandate. So that's a cynical spin. Obviously, good programs ought to be out there. Building ratings ought to be available to owners when they request information. You ought to be able to have transparency for your building department and get the data that is missing. That all ought to be available to every building owner who's trying to do the right thing, him or herself. But if you're actually taking the citywide perspective, the way Spur and NIST and Rockefeller are now thinking, that's going to require you to think beyond just what we used to do with safety. I mean, obviously I can go on, and I obviously want to share the microphones too.
So just you touched on the rating systems, and Ron, I want to give you a moment here to talk about this because certainly I think some of the visions for widespread resiliency rating system is about leveraging public awareness, creating some market-driven forces here to, as we talked about, create some grassroots, getting the people in the community to care about resilience and making that aware. So what's the vision where that actually has long-term success and traction? It seems like it may require mandates more than just voluntary. How do you envision rating systems and USRC playing that role?
Well, we began the process with it to be a voluntary system because we thought mandates would meet significant resistance, especially within the existing building stock. We've been going about a year now. I'm more convinced now that for widespread implementation, it's going to take mandates, cities requiring it either for the new buildings or for vulnerable buildings if they want to have that exposed. I think implementation is just, if you do it on a voluntary basis, it's a long-term project. It's probably a 10 to 20-year process like the LEED system was. They started in '93. They're 23 years into it. It's really well established now.
And the results are scattered.
And the results are scattered. So I think ultimately for resilience, mandates are the best course as we move forward. How they're mandated, I'm not sure, but if I'm going to see resilience implemented with the rating system being part of it before I pass away, I think it's going to have to be some mandates here in the next 5 years.
Dana, one thing we talked a little bit about these, resiliency islands, right? We talked about in terms of the individual building, but it also seems we could end up with resiliency islands that are at the city scale. San Francisco and other that may have more resources to do this type of long-term planning may be okay after the long-term stresses or shocks. How do we and your organization, we as a collective, as a region, but then your leadership, how do we make sure that we don't end up with those citywide resiliency islands? And are there levers that we can pull to make sure that we're actually engaging the whole Bay Area in this?
Resource by the Adaptation Commission, topic, and what really lends itself to
Problems. That they act on their own?
That they can.
That's the other side of the coin.
That's right. Woof, woof.
So two things come to mind. One of them is at a regional level, through Plan Bay Area, we have these things called priority conservation areas, and they're areas that we don't want to build on. And so in terms of land use planning, priority conservation areas have multiple uses. One can be something like recreational use or preserving historic landscapes. Any reason why you would want to preserve a landscape. But I also think that they're a really good tool for avoiding development in the highest hazard areas if they coincide. So I think from a land use perspective, as I said before, one of the best things we can do is keep development off of really high hazard areas. And I know that that's really contentious because there's a lot of development pressure, but that's one way in which we can preserve character, preserve historic landscapes, as well as prevent development that's set up to fail. And the other thing is, I really believe in education about the geology and history of the Bay Area. We have had lots of earthquakes. We've had really big earthquakes that have done terrible things. So anytime we can incorporate an educational component into the landscape, into a display of some sort, I think that people should be aware everywhere that they walk. Everywhere. I'm getting really passionate. Everywhere that they walk, they should know something happened here, something bad happened here, an earthquake happened here. There was damage here. It's part of the landscape that we accept by living in the Bay Area. We have many advantages here, but there are trade-offs just for choosing to live here. So I'm a big fan of educating people on the dynamicism of the landscape and built environment in which we live.
How are those areas enforced? Certainly for something like sea level rise, it seems like they can be used effectively, more so than earthquakes, because the Bay Area, unless you're right on top of the fault, there's not a huge difference in terms of those areas. So how are those then, I understand the definement, and how are they enforced to prevent development there?
All priority conservation areas, as well as priority development areas, which are like opposite, they're all locally nominated and locally managed. So it's a framework that ABAG has created that is sort of a funnel for grants and the concept, the framework, but it's a wide variety of tools that keep them from having development on them.
Right. We have time for a couple more questions. Yeah. Good.
A question for Dana. You mentioned that ABAG's got the local governments together. You also got the major utilities, Caltrans, and BART and things. It seems like if you're saving the buildings, it's great the buildings are occupiable, but you don't have working sewers, you don't have utilities, you can't get around transportation-wise. It doesn't help.
Yeah, so I touched on that a little bit earlier. It's a much more complicated landscape because we have so many different utilities providers in the Bay Area. So it's been a bigger challenge than just getting cities together. That said, we have made many attempts to do so, including the development of a Lifelines Council. And we're focusing, that's started this year as a subcommittee of our regional planning committee. And the focus this year is on water provision. And so each year the council will sort of take on will expand the scope to take on different utilities. But we started with water because with the drought we felt like it was a really critical issue. So the Lifelines Council is the first attempt to bring those people together. We actually have a workshop this Thursday at the Oakland Museum that's bringing together several water utilities and cities to start talking about these sorts of issues. But the complicated thing is that the difference between cities and utilities is that their regulatory environment is, I can't even comprehend it. And they're also very protective of their assets. So if you go to PG&E and you say, what's vulnerable? They'll say, I'm not going to tell you that because they're concerned about security. I think it was a couple of years ago, there was a shooting at a PG&E substation. Somebody shot through the fence. And so if they're concerned about terrorism, and they're concerned about attacks on their systems, and they don't have to tell you. That's the major difference is that since a lot of them are privately owned, they don't have any obligation to tell people what's vulnerable and what they're doing about it. And some utilities are much more forthcoming than others. BART has done a lot about retrofit, and they've been very transparent in sharing their information. But there's a whole other set of challenges that come with utilities that we're just now starting to try to address.
Ron first again.
Yeah, I think it's from a reassurance perspective. I know Caltrans program, they were shocked in '89 and then '94 in Northridge, but they've embarked on a very significant statewide retrofit program. So our bridges are certainly a lot less vulnerable than they were. And we were so lucky in '89, we could have lost all our major bridges had there been about another 5 seconds of strong shaking. We were so close to a major disaster. That will not happen in the next event because of the retrofit program. I am aware of the BART program and also PG&E, and I know they certainly won't want to divulge, but they've spent significant dollars retrofitting a lot of their important assets. East Bay Mud also have a long-term program. So I think the individual utilities are addressing it, and I don't know how it's coordinated at the regional level, but the individual utilities are definitely moving forward with various programs that are beneficial.
I want to just second the concern from the question. So we've heard East Bay Mud, Caltrans, PG&E, others.